more than 2 million workers in industries hit hard by the pandemic could be forced to wait another year before the minimum wage is increased. The Fair Work Commission is considering a 12-month minimum wage freeze until the next financial year. Employers say an increase isn't feasible due to the end of JobKeeper and doubts over the vaccination rollout. Unions are pushing for a 3.5% pay rise to all minimum wage and award-reliant workers from July 1. Well, joining me live for more on this is Sally McManus, Secretary of the Australian Council of Trade Unions. Thanks very much for your time. Do you understand the calls, in particular from some industries, to at least delay the increase, given what they're facing right now, even as uncertainty increases with the vaccine rollout?
I think this is a really terrible, short-sighted view by these industry groups. And I say that because the very worst thing that local businesses, our local economy is facing and will face if we don't do something about it is low wage growth. And if the Fair Work Commission did what these groups are asking for, and that's freeze wages, which effectively means a pay cut for 25% of the workforce who depend on awards, that's money that doesn't come through the front door in terms of sales for local businesses. The amount of money that you end up paying, it's quite small in terms of a weekly increase for a small business that might have 1 or 2 employees. But if you deny that from all the people in the neighbourhood that would see a wage increase, that's a direct loss of revenue to local businesses. And that's the type of thing that will flatline the economy. And that I think it's a really, really short-sighted, disastrous proposal by these employer groups.
The industries in particular that are in trouble, though, I mean, you're essentially saying, you know, more wages means people spend more money. That's true, but they won't get back that money, will they? They might recoup some of it through increased confidence in spending, but this is not a net win for businesses if they pay more wages.
Well, there's 2 things happening. So there's what's happened to big business during the pandemic. So we know the profits are up 15%, so they're up a lot. Big business can afford it. So let's talk about small business, which is the ones that I know all of us have got a lot of sympathy for, because we know how much they've been smashed during the pandemic, just like a whole lot of working people have been too. They will depend on all the minimum wage workers receiving a pay increase. The only way to get that pay increase is this annual wage review. And as I was saying, a small amount of extra money per week, which is effectively, you know, $26 extra a week for a minimum wage worker, is a small amount compared to the extra money that will come in, because you have obviously a whole lot of customers in your local area that are depending on that wage increase. So I would say it's a false economy to say by holding back pay increases for your small number of workers is going to be a good thing for you overall if everyone else isn't getting that pay increase.
That almost sounds like trickle-up economics, though. I get what you're saying around demand and people having more money to spend, but again, what would you think that businesses overall in a net sense wouldn't actually recoup that? I mean, they're unlikely to get all the extra wages they spend out coming back in, are they?
Well, actually, there's a lot of research into this, but just basic common sense too. People who are on minimum wages spend it all. They don't keep it. They're not putting it in their bank accounts. They're not saving it up. They don't put it off to the Cayman Islands into tax havens. They spend it because they need to. The minimum wage in our country is still less than what a living wage is. You need to spend every single cent. And what happens if people get a pay rise?
But are they spending it at cafes and restaurants?
Yeah, well, if they can cover off on their essentials, that's the next thing that they do. It's just discretionary spending will only come through pay increases. It's not going to happen any other way. You know, and simple things like, you know, buying coffee or buying a present for your kids or for members of your family. Your ability to be able to spend obviously depends on whether you get wage increases, and that depends on your actual wage increases and the confidence that you then have. And like normally the economy would also have other options like, you know, increasing the amount of people coming in through tourism or through visas or immigration. None of that's there. Or business investment from overseas. That's not happening. More than ever, we're dependent on one thing, and that's domestic confidence and domestic spending. And that's why doing something about record low wage growth and getting wages going.
You've called for JobKeeper to be extended. Where are you saying particularly it needs to be extended, and how would eligibility work?
Well, I do think it has to be targeted. And by targeted, I mean companies affected by downturns because of the pandemic, and then a threshold. So companies affected or organisations affected because of the pandemic are sort of obvious. It's everyone who's affected by that travel not being able to happen. So that's international as well as domestic travel. But there's also down the line, we actually know manufacturing's doing quite badly because of the knock-on effects for that. So there's all of those areas that are directly affected. So there's there. And secondly, companies should be able to demonstrate a downturn. What we saw change with JobKeeper over a 12-month period is initially it was just given to companies. Then they started restricting the criteria, unfortunately, in the early part of it, even though it was a good thing to get it out there, even if there were mistakes. Some companies, unfortunately, still had profits and they kept JobKeeper.
So extending JobKeeper, I mean, this scheme existed because businesses essentially couldn't afford to keep on workers. It was needed as a wage subsidy. It must be a concession that any business that needs JobKeeper can't afford to be paying more in wages.
Well, it's got to do with whether or not they're affected by the pandemic. And the thing is JobKeeper is gone, right? So that went 2 weeks ago. This minimum wage that we're talking about increase doesn't come in until the 1st of July. So what we're saying is that JobKeeper, which is a minimum amount, which isn't the minimum wage, it's less than the minimum wage, still being provided to those companies where they need it, is something that's needed. And that's separate and complementary to how much we're paying minimum wage workers.
So does that mean you think JobKeeper just needs to go until July? Because working in, at the same time, JobKeeper to keep the jobs there because the business can't afford it, but also pay rises, they don't really seem to make sense together, do they?
Well, the affording bit also has to do with things a business doesn't control, things that are beyond its control as a normal business. So, for example, what we saw in Brisbane just recently, these snap lockdowns, we still haven't vaccinated all of our frontline workers. So this could happen at any time, unfortunately, still across the country. If tomorrow this happened in Perth and it's a variant from South Africa and we have to make sure it doesn't spread and they shut down there's no JobKeeper. So that would be a very straightforward way of providing it. But it's not, people don't get the minimum wage. They only get $1,000 a fortnight. It's way less than that.
No, I know, but it's a significant underwriting or subsidy, if you like. Let me just ask you quickly and finally on that. You mentioned the snap lockdown. The Queensland government said before that, 10 days before that snap lockdown, we don't need to do citywide lockdowns anymore. We've got this under control with contact tracing. Then suddenly changed their mind. Is that disappointing from the Queensland government to make things so much harder for business and then for workers?
Well, there's so many links to the chain, if I can put it that way. So in the case of the Brisbane situation, you depend on your contact tracing, and your contact tracing depends on what people tell you and what you know. And so, you would always love all information to be perfect and to perfectly know all the contacts that people have had, but sometimes you don't. And if there's any question that we don't know that and it's out there in the community, the very worst thing for the economy and the jobs would be that the coronavirus, after everything we've done, started spreading. So, I mean, a snap lockdown allows everyone to stop moving so that you can do that. And they have been proven to be pretty effective, I'd say.
Well, but how do we say that from Brisbane? How do we know without the snap lockdown that things still would have been okay? Doesn't that, what you say there, means any single lockdown will be justified as long as things are okay at the end? They might have been okay without it. Isn't that the point as well?
Well, the coronavirus spreads because people move around. You think about what happened in Sydney at Christmas time. One person went to a BWS and spread it to a whole lot of people. I'm not saying the New South Wales government should or shouldn't have done a snap lockdown, but where you do have them, you stop people, travelling like that. And the more you slow it down, the better your contact and tracing is. And like 3-day lockdown, no one likes it. No one likes it. No one wants to do it. But I tell you what, it's a hell of a lot better than being like Europe.